tell us about some kind of crazy murder cases from Dewitt County's history. All right, Christin, take it away.
As Terry said, I am a clerk here at the library. I also run the library's podcast. It is the Vespasian Water Public Library District podcast. It is a long name, but it's worth a listen. We cover the library, library services, the archives and collections, and also local history. And it was while researching a local history episode that I came across these murders. So I was doing an episode on the infamous Mayor Pugh, who prior to his entry into politics, he was a practicing physician here in town. And he happened to witness the murder of former Chief of Police Tony Musser at the Interurban Station. He also ended up doing the autopsy on the man. Now, this article also mentioned the murder of another Chief of Police here in Clinton, John Struble, to whom Tony Musser was the night captain for and witnessed that murder. So the article included a list of 22 murders that the author could recall that occurred between 1855 and 1913. Now, he said there were 23 murders. I've counted that list multiple times. I can only come up with 22. So I set about looking into these murders because 2 of them I had already covered for the podcast. So I wanted to find out about the rest of them. Now, I'm not a historian, I'm not a professional researcher, and I only have about an hour to talk about 22 murders. So the research I did is probably not as in-depth as it could have been. And for some of the murders, there's just not a whole lot of information I was able to find. So I'm going to do these murders in chronological order, which is going to take us all over Dewitt County. And we're going to start just a few blocks south of here at the square, where in 1855, Isaac Wyant killed Anson Rusk in the county courthouse. Now, the foundation of this murder was laid in 1854, the summer of 1854. See, the Rusk and Wyant families had had bad blood over land. And Isaac Wyant was something of a bully. He was a known bully. He had threatened to whip Anson Rusk previously. He had also horsewhipped Anson Rusk's brother-in-law. So when Rusk and his friends met Wyant and his friends on the road to Marion, which is now Dewitt, things were a little tense. Words were exchanged, things got heated, and when Isaac Wyant went to take off his coat to escalate things further, Anson Rusk shot him in the arm. Medicine being what it was in 1854, the treatment for a gunshot wound to the arm was amputation. In October of 1855, Isaac Wyant walked into the county courthouse, into the county clerk's office, and shot Anson Rusk 3 times, including once in the head. He fled but was captured and was eventually brought to trial. The case was heard by Judge David Davis. The prosecution, which was led by State's Attorney Ward Lamont, he was assisted by C.H. Moore, a young McLean County lawyer by the name of Harvey Haws, and future President Abraham Lincoln, contended that this was an act of revenge. Isaac Wyant shot Anson Rusk because Anson Rusk caused Isaac Wyant to lose his arm. However, the defense countered this. The defense was led by Leonard Swett and William Orme, and the defense contended that he was actually insane at the time of the killing, having been driven insane by the excessive administration of chloroform during his amputation surgery. So, people testified on behalf of Isaac Wyant, saying that he had become increasingly paranoid since the surgery, that he was keeping the house shut up, even in the summertime, that he had threatened his own sister because he was convinced Anson Rusk was going to get him. The defense also brought in a few doctors to testify to his insanity, including Dr. McFarland from the State Hospital in Jacksonville. And he testified that between Isaac Wyant's age, his predisposition to insanity because his uncle had also been committed, and the administration of the chloroform, that he was indeed insane at the time of the killing. Now, none of the doctors could testify for certain that the chloroform contributed to the insanity or that the insanity would be permanent. However, the jury bought this, And Isaac Wyatt was found not guilty by reason of insanity. It is one of the earliest successful uses of the insanity defense in the country. Isaac Wyatt was remanded to the state hospital in Jacksonville for 3 years, after which he moved back to Dewitt County for a number of years, before moving to Indiana, where he was at one time found dead near a brush pile on a farm with a bullet hole in his head. What goes around comes around.
Yeah.
So a few years after the Isaac Wyatt trial, in 1861, W.H. Summers shot and killed Postmaster Roberts either inside or just outside of the post office here in Clinton. Now, it's said he did this upon a slight provocation. I don't know how slight your provocation is to go shooting someone, and I don't know what this particular provocation is because there's very little information about this case that I was able to find. However, I did find that the public was so incensed by this killing that there was a fear of mob justice until they said cooler heads prevailed. As it was, Summers was taken to McLean County, where he was tried and found not guilty. I don't have any information about why. I can only assume it was a self-defense plea. This will not be the last postmaster I discuss today. A few years later, in May of 1864, Justin Hill shot and killed Justice of the Peace Robert Barnett. I don't have any details about why this shooting happened, only that Justin Hill turned himself in immediately afterwards. Robert Barnett, he was very unlucky on that particular Friday 13th. He was shot in the neck. The bullet was removed from just below his right shoulder. He was also shot in the right side, and it exited out his back. Either wound would have been fatal, and as it was, he didn't succumb to his injuries until the next day. Hill gave himself up immediately. He was taken to first Macon County out of fear of mob justice. The preliminary trial was held in Macon County. The main trial was held in McLean County, where he was found not guilty. Again, I don't know why. My guess is self-defense.
That's where you need to go for.
After Justin Hill was acquitted, he returned to Clinton, returned to his saddling business, and then later was elected as a member of the state legislature. He will not be the last politician I talk about today. 13 years a saddler. So he makes saddles. So 13 years later, we had a big gap. This will be our first murder outside of Clinton in Creek Township, I believe near Lane. So William Davenport was headed to his brother's house to sharpen his scythe when Eli Bell called to him from the road from his house, and Davenport stopped to have a chat. So Eli Bell was standing on one side of the fence leaning on a broom handle. Davenport was sitting sideways on his horse with his feet up on the fence. They were having a chat. Well, the chat soon turned to money, and like politics, religion, and sports, nothing soured the conversation quite like money. Bell claimed that Davenport owed him $2, and Davenport denied the claim.
I want to make $2.
Words got heated, and because they are grown, mature, rational men, Davenport invited Bell to step out into the road to settle things, and as Davenport got down off of his horse to do so, he dropped the scythe. When he bent over to pick it up, Bell took that opportunity to whack him in the back of the head with the broom handle, and Davenport retaliated by hitting Bell in the head with the scythe.
Ew.
It caused a hole in the back of his head on the back left side that did not penetrate the brain, the membrane of the brain, but it penetrated to the brain, causing infection, suppuration, and hemorrhaging, swelling. He succumbed a few days later. It actually took a little while for him to die. So Davenport was arrested and claimed self-defense because he did have evidence of being hit with the broom handle, and he was acquitted. So, November of 1879, Thomas Cooley was shot to death by his neighbors Ed and Robert Wills over in Kenny. Now, there had been bad blood between these neighbors for quite a while. The latest incident was over a ditch. Thomas Cooley had gone over to talk to the Wills brothers about this ditch and found Ed near the barn. Words were exchanged. Ed Wills told Thomas Cooley to get off his property. Thomas Cooley made like he was going for his gun, and Ed Wills shot at him. Robert Wills was returning home at the time, heard the shots, went out to the barn in time to see Thomas Cooley charging at him on the horse. He jumped out of the way, fell into a hedge, but still managed to get a shot off. The horse turned, and Thomas Cooley fell from the horse. He did not move. The Wills brothers sent for a neighbor to come and collect him. He was taken home where Thomas Cooley died. So at the trial, it came out in testimony that the bad blood between Cooley and the Wills brothers, particularly Edmund Wills, started when Edmund Wills reportedly sent an indecent letter to Thomas Cooley's wife while Cooley was away in Missouri. Mrs. Cooley forwarded this letter to her husband in Missouri, who immediately returned, confronted Ed Wills about the letter, and when Ed Wills paid to reimburse him from his travel back from Missouri. However, Thomas Cooley managed to find all sorts of reasons to continue to pick at the Wills brothers, the latest one being the ditch. There was a ditch that the Wills brothers wanted to use for irrigation that the matter was settled. You filled in the ditch. So that's why he had to come over that night, was to yell more about this ditch. The letter in question that supposedly started off the bad blood was not entered into evidence at the trial because it couldn't be found. However, Mrs. Cooley also testified that her husband did not own a gun. Counter testimony stated that not only did Thomas Cooley own a gun, he had been seen in public repeatedly threatening Ed Wills with this gun. It was also reported that at one point he saw Ed Wills talking with some men in front of the store, walked up to him, hit him in the head with a rock, and kept walking without saying a word.
Sweet.
Due to this history of behavior, the Wills brothers were found not guilty by reason of self-defense. However, Mrs. Cooley then filed a civil suit on wrongful death for her husband and ended up winning $350 and 40 acres of adjoining land, which is kind of funny considering the Wills brothers had been trying to sell their farm to get away from Thomas Cooley. So February of 1884 over in Waynesville, this will be the first of our 3 saloon murders. So as it was, Henry Teal, Wiley Marvel, Bryce Alsbury, and a few other people were in a saloon, drinking and arguing as you do. The argument continued as they left and were parting ways when reportedly Henry Teal called Bryce Alsbury a damn son of a bitch, and Bryce Alsbury turned, came back to him, and when he was about 8 to 10 feet away, Teal hollered for him to stop. He didn't, and so Teal shot him. Hit him in the chest near the heart, killing him. At the first trial in, I believe, 1884, later 1884, Henry Teal was indicted for murder, and Wiley Marvel was indicted as an accessory. Wiley Marvel was found not guilty. Henry Teal was found guilty, however, the verdict ended up being thrown out because the judge felt that the jury did not understand the meaning of reasonable doubt. There had been credible evidence presented by credible witnesses that Bryce Alsbury had been making threats. This was relayed by the bartender to Henry Teal. It was also said that he had a slingshot on his person. And so the verdict got thrown out, and there was a second trial in 1885. At this trial, again, Henry Teal was found guilty. Again, the verdict was thrown out, this time due to a couple of the jurors professing their belief of Teal's guilt, which basically amounts to jury misconduct. Henry Teal was tried again, third time in 1886. This time, the trial got a change of venue to Havana. And by this point, several of the important witnesses had disappeared. They couldn't be found. So the prosecutor entered in a verdict or a ruling motion, whatever, is in Latin. I don't know what it means or how to pronounce it, but what it means is that basically they can't proceed any further. They won't proceed any further, but they reserve the right to prosecute him again. Turned out that it meant nothing. Henry Teal was freed, but he ended up dying a few years later in 1891 in Louisiana when his inexperience crossing bayou bridges cost him his life. He was swept into the water, and his body was found a few days later. In September of 1889 in Kenny, James Waldron killed Daniel Lindley. So James Waldron was supposedly going to town and then either going to Clinton or Atlanta. Reports differ, but it really doesn't matter because he didn't go either place. He went back home to find that his wife wasn't there. So he went looking for her and reportedly found her in the embrace of his friend and local merchant, Daniel Lindley. And in a rage, he ended up stabbing Lindley multiple times. He stabbed him in the back over the kidneys, and he got him, I believe, once in the groin. I'm not sure what he was aiming for. Now,
The other weapon.
Mrs. Waldron fled the scene and reportedly hid in a cornfield all night from her husband. Daniel Lindley also tried to make a run for his brother's house, which was something like half a mile away, but he collapsed and died on the way. Waldron turned himself in. Now, at the trial, Mrs. Waldron was the only witness to the actual crime. Everybody else could only testify to after the fact. And she told a very different story. She said that she was just shooing some neighbors' turkeys home when she happened upon Daniel Lindley, who engaged her in conversation about her husband. He wanted to talk business with him. And it was while they were having this innocent conversation that James Waldron came up in a rage and attacked Lindley. Now, even though it's said that Mrs. Waldron had the unsavory reputation that would have made her husband's account of the incident believable, the jury chose to believe Mrs. Waldron, and James Waldron was found guilty. And he was sentenced to 16 years in the penitentiary. However, he was pardoned after 2 because he had contracted consumption, and he was allowed to go home and die. If you're keeping track, this is the first conviction we've gotten that's actually resulted in jail time. So in the summer of 1894, over in Farmer City, John Smith killed James Kirkendall. Now, James Kirkendall had come up from Kentucky the summer before and occupied James Smith's tenant house. However, by the summer of 1895, a dispute led John Smith to evicting him from the tenant house, and James Kirkendall did not take this well, to the point that he threatened to kill John Smith, and John Smith took this threat seriously. He ended up buying a gun to protect himself. So one evening, the evening of July 28th, James Kirkendall, his wife, and another man by the name of Mr. Boggs were walking past John Smith's house. And James Kirkendall decided to renew the quarrel. Things started to get heated. James Kirkendall ended up advancing towards John Smith carrying a club. And so John Smith took out his gun and shot at him. He gave him a warning shot. Kirkendall refused to be warned. The second shot hit Kirkendall in the gut. He staggered out into the road and died. Now, at the trial, there was some discrepancies of whether or not that Kirkendall was actually in John Smith's yard. Smith said he was, but Mrs. Kirkendall and Mr. Boggs said he wasn't. In fact, Mr. Boggs said that he only had a little bit of fence post, not an actual club, which I don't know how that makes a difference when you're fixing to bludgeon someone, but there you go. But it's known that no other weapon was found on Kirkendall's person. So really, this case came down to character. John Smith was known as a peaceable person. James Kirkendall was not. In fact, multiple witnesses from Kentucky, including his ex-wife, and from Bureau County, Illinois, where he had once lived, both came to testify to what a garbage human he was. As a result, John Smith was found not guilty by reason of self-defense. Remember when I said that we'd be talking about a postmaster and a politician again? Here we are.
All right.
December of 1895, over in Weldon, Postmaster John Pace kills State Representative Dr. William Taylor in the post office. So, as it transpires, John Pace believed that his wife was having an affair with Dr. Taylor since about 1889. The first incident was Mrs. Pace and Dr. Taylor checking into a Decatur hotel as husband and wife. Now, Mrs. Pace explained this away as saying that it was just a joke. The Paces and the Taylors were friends, and they just happened to be checking in at the hotel at the same time and thought it would be funny. But they stayed in separate rooms, and John Pace believed this until Mrs. Pace filed for divorce in 1884, citing brutality. He countered by citing that she had been intimate with Dr. Taylor, and he had evidence of this. Now, the divorce ended up actually being withdrawn a year later, even though the couple never lived together again. However, Dr. Taylor wanted that evidence because John Pace was not only going to file charges against him in the Knights of Pythias, which they were both members, but he was also planning on bringing a damages suit for the alienation of his wife's affections. He had an affidavit from the hotel clerk about the night that they checked in together, and he also had letters from his wife to his wife's sister saying that Dr. Taylor had performed 2 abortions for her. So on the evening of December 28th, Dr. Taylor goes to the post office to collect these items from John Pace. He first offers to give him $500 for this evidence. John Pace declines. Dr. Taylor then pulls out a gun and again asks for the evidence. So first John Pace gets into the safe, pretending to look for these items. And Dr. Taylor drops his guard a little bit. He then shifts, John Pace shifts, and goes to the desk and says, oh, they must be in the desk. He starts searching through the desk. And when Dr. Taylor drops his guard again, John Pace takes out his gun and shoots at him 3 times, hitting him twice. Once in the left side, once in the right temple, killing him. Due to the notoriety of the people involved in this case, they immediately convened a coroner's jury. The first coroner's jury was unsuccessful because 5 voted for manslaughter, 1 voted for justifiable homicide, so they couldn't come to an agreement. So the second coroner's jury was immediately convened. They all voted for justifiable homicide. And then in March of 1896, when the case was brought in front of the grand jury chose not to indict, and the case was dropped. So, just a few months later, in April of 1896, in Clinton, another marriage came to a tragic end when Ed Poland killed his wife and his mother-in-law. So Ed Poland and his wife Myrtle had been married in 1894, and it was rough from the I-do's. They would separate and get back together, separate and get back together. The last straw apparently came after he moved her to Iowa. I can relate. She left him and came back home to live with her mother, stepfather, and younger siblings. Ed followed his wife and did everything he possibly could to try to get her to come back to him, including going to the post office, getting her mail, and refusing to give it to her. So on the day in question, April 3rd of 1896, he apparently, on his way to go hunting, he said, that's why he had the shotgun, no worries, stopped by his wife's house and told her that if you agree to meet with me later in a secluded area alone, I'll give you this mail back, particularly a letter from your friend in Iowa that I know you really want. For some reason, Myrtle declined. But they continued to talk in the yard until Mary McMullen, Myrtle's mother, got sick of it. She came outside to get her daughter to come in the house. Ed was tired of his mother-in-law's meddling, So he shot her in the face with the shotgun. He then shot his wife in the back of the head, leaving their bodies in the front yard while he ran for it. The chase extended to the railroad tracks, where he attempted to end his life. However, the freight train that he tried to jump in front of was moving too slowly. The cowcatcher did his job, and he was thrown off the tracks with minor injuries to stand trial. At the trial, he tried to claim insanity, that he was out of his mind when this happened. He didn't know what he was doing, and he didn't know it was wrong, despite the testimony of multiple neighbors, including one who actually heard him say he was going to shoot his wife right before he shot her.
But she had to get in the hole in the ground first, right?
So he claimed insanity. Dr. McFarland from the State Hospital in Jacksonville came up and actually did the examination. This is the same Dr. McFarland who declared Isaac Wyant insane. He examined Ed Poland and declared him sane. And so he was sentenced to life in prison. So, it's Christmas in 1899 over in Weldon. And there was a group of gentlemen drinking in a saloon, as you do. So, they're playing cards. Doc Markham is one of these gentlemen. Doc Markham had come up from Kentucky just about 10 months earlier. He befriended a man by the name of Murdoch from Watseka. Murdoch was playing cards with Harry Summers, and things got heated between the two men. And because Doc Markham had never heard that minding your business is free, he insinuated himself into this argument on behalf of Murdoch. Things escalated, and Murdoch ended up shooting Harry Summers, grazing him in the side. Summers, who had a reputation for being a hothead that he hadn't fought anybody in years, actually got a swing in and hit Murdoch before he was shot again. This got shot, killing him. So Doc Markham ran for it, but he was captured, taken to Clinton, and he had to stand trial. He, of course, claimed self-defense. What worked in his favor was that not only was he and the victim drunk, so were the witnesses, and the witnesses were also known gamblers. In fact, 4 of them, including Murdoch, had been fined over in Logan County for gambling. So he ended up being found not guilty by reason of self-defense. Now, Harry Summers' wife ended up filing a damages suit against the saloon owners for, as she says, selling the whiskey that took away her husband's good sense. Given the fact of his reputation and that he's gambling in a saloon on Christmas Day, I'm not going to say he had much to begin with. But she ended up later filing another suit on behalf of her son. The suits went all the way up to the Supreme Court, where they were eventually reversed and remanded against her victory. She ended up dying a few years later of a heart attack, leaving her 10-year-old son an orphan. Doc Markham returned to Kentucky, where he was reportedly fatally injured while helping to haul logs, and one of the logs broke loose and rolled over him. Not even a year later, the first murder of the new year in 1900 happened in August over in Waynesville, and this will be the first of our farm animal-related killings. So, Park Cunningham was on his way home with his son Leslie when their neighbor, 68-year-old John Keene, stopped them to complain that their hogs were in his corn. So Cunningham and his son split up looking for these hogs, couldn't find them. Again, Cunningham starts to go home. Again, Keene stops him. He's not thrilled with this. Words are exchanged. Keene reportedly hits Cunningham with his walking stick. When Cunningham gets off his horse to confront him about this, Keene then slashes him across the midsection, basically and then runs off, leaving him to die. Because the wound was reportedly about 8 inches long, and it ended up exposing his internal organs, cutting his intestines, and one of his lungs. He lived long enough to give a deathbed statement about what happened. However, at the trial, apparently John Keene presented a much different version of this incident. I don't know what it is because I couldn't find it, but I'm guessing he pled self-defense, that it was about self-defense, and the jury must have bought it. They only deliberated for an hour and a half before he was found not guilty. A few years later, he moved to Oklahoma, where he was reportedly, and I quote, cut to ribbons with a corn knife by a Native American. So, lived by the sword, died by the sword. Not even a year later, over in Dewitt, we saw another murder. So, in mid-June of 1901, at a church social, local boy Ed Taylor decided that Kentuckian-born brewer said something disparaging about the ladies of Dewitt, and he was going to defend their honor. He ends up hitting him in the face with a whiskey bottle.
Yeah.
Fellow Kentuckian and friend of Warren Brewer, Clay Condor, jumps in to defend his friend. All-out brawl breaks out. Sees that the two Kentucky boys get whipped, and Brewer requires medical attention. A month later, at a band concert, Ed Taylor's brother sees Brewer and Condor and says, "Hey, if you boys are looking for some trouble, you can get it right here." Brewer and Condor declined the invitation, but Ed Taylor insisted. Another brawl breaks out. This time, Clay Condor manages to cut a few of the men with a knife, and Warren Brewer fires his pistol twice, hitting and killing Ed Taylor. The boys flee the scene. However, Clay Condor was arrested almost immediately by Ed Taylor's father. Warren Brewer, however, makes his escape and hides in a cornfield, all the rage apparently, until he can get to his employer's house where he can arrange to turn himself in. At the trial, there was a very strong case for self-defense. Condor and Brewer were known as good boys. They were not known to cause any trouble in Dewitt County, and in fact, people from Kentucky and Dewitt County both testified on their behalf. However, Ed Taylor was known to be a hothead. He was particularly quarrelsome with young men his age that he felt were strangers, and he tended to run with a group that liked to get him in and out of trouble. And in this case, they failed at the getting out part. Warren Brewer and Clay Condor were found not guilty by reason of self-defense, and they ended up moving back to Kentucky a few months later. Our final saloon murder happened in November of 1901 in Clinton. I have very little information about it. What I do know is that a bar fight at the Blue Goose Saloon turned deadly when Henry Bowles hit Alan Pryor in the head with a beer bottle, killing him. So at the trial, he basically pled guilty. Henry Bowles pled guilty to manslaughter and received an indeterminate sentence. What this means is that he had to serve at least a year in prison. Afterwards, he could either be pardoned or paroled. A case of mistaken identity led to the death of Lydia Grant in Clinton in September of 1904. So, a few years earlier, a white woman by the name of Mary married a black barber by the name of Jackson. They were promptly run out of town. Upon her husband's death, Mary returned to live with her parents, the Gerards. And another black barber, this one by the name of Thomas Waters, began courting her. When he proposed marriage, Mary declined, and because Thomas Waters, like many men, did not take the rejection kindly, things escalated from there. The night before the shooting, he went to Mary's house and demanded that she run away with him or he would kill her and himself. For some reason, she was not persuaded. The next day, after making a stop at the hardware store to rent a shotgun under the pretense of hunting, sensing a theme here, he goes once again to Mary's house, but Mary won't even come outside to talk with him. So Thomas Waters fires a shot through the window, attempting to hit Mary, and unfortunately ends up hitting and killing Lydia Grant, a domestic in the Gerards' employ. Some of the shotgun pellets did hit Mary, but her injuries were non-fatal. So at the trial, Thomas Waters attempts to claim self-defense by saying that Mr. Gerard had a gun and actually had shot at him, but nobody was buying this, and he was sentenced to 14 years in prison. He serves his time. He got out a little early for good behavior. He returns to Clinton and resumes his practice as a barber. In 1918, he's busted for bootlegging with 2 other men and ends up serving 30 days in jail. In 1920, he was busted for barbering without a license, and once he paid the fine, his license was reinstated and he was allowed to work again. And as far as I know, that ended his life of crime. In August of 1906, here in Clinton, 60-year-old James Whitehead killed 53-year-old Ira Day. Now, Ira Day had sold James Whitehead a parcel of land that didn't have a well on it. However, the land that sat between Ira Day's house and James Whitehouse's house did. And he said he could use that well. So on the day of the shooting, Mrs. Whitehead is shooing some of Ira Day's chickens home when Ira Day comes out and tells her in some not so kind language with a few insults thrown in to leave the chickens alone, and you also are no longer allowed to use the well. Naturally, when her husband comes home, she relays this to him. And because men are just cool, calm, collected, rational creatures, he immediately takes a bucket and goes out to the well. Ira Day comes out, takes that bucket away from him and starts hitting him with it.
Yeah.
And James Whitehead pulls out his pistol and shoots him in the head, killing him.
Oops. Yep.
So at the trial, the gun and the dead kid bucket were entered into evidence, and there was a pretty solid case of self-defense for James Whitehead. This shooting happened in front of multiple witnesses, including both men's wives. They testified to what they had seen. James Whitehead, however, gave some very confused testimony, stating that he had actually hit Ira Day a couple of times with the bucket before it was taken away, that they were several feet apart when he fired the gun, and that Ira Day's hands were down at the time. However, the coroner said that they could only have been a couple of feet apart when they were shot, and multiple witnesses said that James Whitehead never got a lick in with the bucket. So despite the confused testimony, James Whitehead was found not guilty by reason of self-defense. So over in Birkbeck in October of 1907, some unknown men killed John Tanneville. Now, John Tanneville was part of a black railroad gang that was working over in Birkbeck. And the night in question, they all came to Clinton to get their drink on. Once sufficiently imbibed, they went back to Birkbeck, and a craps game broke out. Well, this craps game apparently turned hostile, and Tanneville reportedly cut one of the men, setting a group of them off on him, chasing him. He attempted to get help at a local house, but they turned him away, said you need to go to the railroad boss. A couple of men in a buggy came upon John Tanneville because he was looking for an officer. These men testified that they had seen a group of 4 black men come with clubs and rocks, come after him. He took off running. They chased him. The men in the buggy actually kept up with this chase until Tanneville jumped a fence and the 4 men turned back. They thought everything was taken care of, and they went on. John Tanneville was later found dead, beaten to death on the railroad tracks by the southbound passenger train. And it was determined that his death came to him at the hands of unknown others. However, 4 men ended up being arrested for the crime. It was Dudley Trice, the man that Tanneville allegedly cut, William Mundy, Henry Adams, and Portico Barcos. But the grand jury felt that there wasn't enough evidence to indict these men, and they were released. In 1913, In Detroit, Michigan, Henry Adams allegedly confessed to killing John Tanneville. However, he was never brought to Dewitt County because, aside from his confession, there was no other evidence to tie him to the crime. And so, as a result, no one was ever tried for the murder. Our final farm animal-related killing happened in July of 1909 when John Poland kills 68-year-old Asher Arnold. Now, Asher Arnold was pasturing his horse in a vacant lot next to John Poland's place. John Poland ends up going looking for Asher Arnold because he says that the horse is eating his sunflowers. A fight ensues. Asher Arnold goes to get his horse while John Poland goes home. John Poland then comes out to renew the argument along with John Poland's wife. Now, Mrs. Poland attempts first to defuse the situation, but then decides to up the ante by accusing Asher Arnold of stealing apples. Arnold calls her a goddamn liar, and John Poland takes offense to this and shoots him 4 times. The killing shot hit him in the head. So at the trial, they tried to make a case of self-defense for John Poland. However, even John Poland said they were more than 10 feet apart when he fired, that he was shooting to kill. He did not stop firing until Asher Arnold fell, and that even though he said that he was going to kill him if he stepped any closer, Asher Arnold said this, the distance kind of negated that. So he ended up being found guilty of manslaughter, and he was given an indeterminate sentence, of which he served about a year. It should be noted that in the course of the investigation, they determined that the sunflowers did not, in fact, look like they had been eaten by a horse. July of 1910, so almost exactly a year later, Alex Matthews allegedly killed James Demery. So James Demery was an IC freight house worker, and he was drinking near the ice plant with Alex Matthews and another man by the name of Frank Morrell. Now, Frank Morrell was witnessing this. This is what he told police later, after they found him. That Alex Matthews and James Demery got into an argument about money and the division of the wages. Matthews says we could settle this if we go to the Jungles, which was a place just north of the ice house. So they went, and as they went, he heard Demery say, "Don't hit me." Well, apparently, Matthews came back later alone and said that he had killed James Demery. Frank Morrell, instead of going to the police, went to a freight car to sleep, as you do. A night watch confirmed this, that he had seen 2 black men walking along the railroad tracks heading north towards the ballpark, arguing, but he didn't see him after that. James Demery's body was found alongside the railroad tracks. He had been beaten to death. He had a hole in his skull they feel was from a bolt or some other heavy piece of iron. Naturally, suspicion turned to Alex Matthews. They went looking for him. Alex Matthews was already known to the police because he liked to get into arguments with the other black workers at the freight house, and he had gone to jail for a little while for threatening to cut their boss. But they couldn't find him. They looked for him, I believe, in Springfield. They knew that at some point he lived in East St. Louis and Cairo, Illinois. They never found him. And as a result, no one was ever tried for the crime. Meanwhile, Frank Demery's family could not be located, and so he was laid to rest at Woodlawn Cemetery. Just days after this murder, Chief Struble was killed. So, Chief John Struble was performing a stakeout for a man by the name of Albert Sant. The Albert Sant had some items that kept going missing from the icebox on his back porch. And at first he thought it was just boys doing it, but when it wouldn't stop, he decided to contact authorities. So he and Chief John Struble set up in the neighbor's backyard so they could watch the back of the house and witnessed a man creeping around in the yard. Albert Sant told Chief John Struble to shoot him. Chief Struble declined, and the man left without apparently taking anything. They decided to call it a night, and as soon as they left, the man came back and completed his felony. So the next stakeout, Chief John Struble brought his night captain, Tony Musser, with him. And they witnessed a man, again, creeping around in Sant's backyard. Again, Tony Musser tells Chief John Struble to shoot him. Again, he declines. Instead, this gentleman backs into almost exactly where they're standing. So John Struble takes that upon himself to leap on this guy. He jumps on this man's back, and because the man was a bigger man, he just kind of walked away with him on his back. And so Tony Musser jumps into the fray, takes him out of the legs, and even while these two men are on him, have him on the ground, he is still able to get his hand in his pocket and fire over his shoulder. He shoots and kills John Struble, hitting him in the head. In the confusion, he manages to get away. And despite the assistance of local law enforcement agencies, they can't find him. And in the ensuing months, Tony Musser was promoted to police chief, and multiple men were arrested and interrogated for this murder. However, they finally got someone in their sights that they thought was the likely culprit, and that was John Weir. And it wasn't until 1913 that they actually finally captured him. He was in Iowa telling the story of shooting Chief Struble, not realizing one of the boys that he was talking to was a local boy who relayed this information to his father, who took it to the authorities. And so John Weir was arrested and brought back to Clinton to stand trial. So at this time, Tony Musser was working in Decatur. He came back up for the trial. He identified John Weir in court, but John Weir's defense presented multiple witnesses who alibied John Weir as working on a farm in another town at the time of the murder. As a result, John Weir was found not guilty, and no one else was ever tried for the crime. A few months after the conclusion, actually a few weeks after the conclusion of this trial, Tony Musser would also be murdered. But first, we're going to head over to Farmer City in February of 1911 when Arthur Jones killed U.S. Grant Kendall. So U.S. Kendall was apparently having an affair with Arthur Jones's wife, and he was not keen on ending it. But Arthur Jones ended up filing a $10,000 damages suit against Kendall for alienating his wife's affections. The only way that suit got dropped was because Kendall said that he would stop coming around Mrs. Jones's wife and coming around the house. On the day of the shooting, Arthur Jones goes home to find his wife and Kendall on the back porch. He ends up firing 3 times and killing him. So at the trial, it was found out that U.S. Grant Kendall had no intention of breaking off this affair. And he said that he loved Mrs. Jones, didn't care who knew it, and that included his wife, who was in the process of leaving him at the time he was murdered. His wife also testified that Mr. Jones had come to see her and said that if her husband ever set foot on his property again, he would not leave it. Mr. Kendall was so known to be so enthusiastic about this affair that he reportedly carried a gun that he said was specifically for Arthur Jones if he tried to interfere with the affair. So witnesses to the shooting included 2 neighbors who were complicit in the affair. They knew that the affair was going on, and one of the neighbors had been bribed with whiskey not only to not say anything, but also to allow them to use his house to continue the affair.
Yeah.
So, Mr. Jones said that when he shot Kendall, he had leapt towards him, putting his hand in his coat pocket. He thought he was going for his gun. That's why he shot him. However, when Kendall was searched after the fact, all they found in his overcoat were some money, some papers, including the damages suit, some cigars, a half quart of whiskey, a full quart of whiskey, and a package of fresh beef. It was mystery meat then, it's mystery meat now. As a result, Arthur Jones was found not guilty by reason of self-defense. The Judge Cochran gave him his gun back and told him not to shoot anyone else ever again. It should be noted that his lawyer actually picked up the gun, Arthur Jones did. So, December 30th, 1913, just a few weeks after the conclusion of the John Weir trial, Tony Musser was shot and killed at the interurban station by Carl Pearson. So Carl Pearson, he worked for the Illinois Central until the strike of 1911. He was very involved in this strike, including starting something called the Strike Bulletin, which he used to keep other strikers informed about what was going on, even after the strike failed. So after the strike failed, his favorite thing to do with the Strike Bulletin was to out and insult men he felt were scabs. Now, when Tony Musser came up to testify at the trial, he ended up getting work at the IC Bullpen. This put him on Carl Pearson's radar, and he ended up writing a scathing article about the man, not only insinuating the old rumor that Tony Musser was actually responsible for shooting Chief John Struble, but that he did it intentionally. For whatever reason, Tony Musser wasn't thrilled with this article. Now, either by chance or by design, the two men ended up at the interurban station at the same time, where Tony Musser proceeded to beat the living hell out of Carl Pearson, to the extent that several men stepped in and separated them. Carl Pearson started to walk away. He stopped, turned, pulled a pistol out of his pocket, and proceeded to shoot Tony Musser 7 times in front of 40 witnesses, because this was at the interurban station. He then immediately started angling for self-defense, because he insisted that the sheriff take his booking photo with the blood still all over his face from the beating, and the sheriff declined. Now, he had a lawyer from Chicago, Frank Comerford, come down. He also insisted that this booking photo be taken. He was also told no. Frank Comerford went so far as to insult the sheriff's wife to try to get this to happen, and for some reason that didn't persuade him. This just began the dramatics of this case, because then there was rumors about that there was going to be a lynching, that they would hang him, there was going to be mob justice, that Carl Pearson had to be spirited away to Chicago for his own safety. There was a writ of habeas corpus. When he finally posted bail to get out of jail for this, he immediately went to be the guest of honor at a strike conference. The trial ended up getting a change of venue to Lincoln. And so the defense claimed that this was actually, the beating was actually orchestrated by Tony Musser, that he had arranged to have Carl Pearson there for this beating. However, their own witnesses couldn't testify to this plot. And in fact, some of the witnesses agreed with the prosecution, saying that yes, there was a considerable distance, 7 to 10 feet, between Musser and Pearson when he was shot, and that Musser was still being restrained for the first 2 shots. There was also some question of whether or not the defense had tried to influence their own witnesses. Despite all of this, Carl Pearson was found not guilty. At the same time that this trial was going on, Carl Pearson was again being sued for defamation, and Mrs. Musser was also suing him for wrongful death. He won the defamation case, he lost the wrongful death case, and he ended up moving back to Chicago in 1914. Now, a curious postscript to this particular murder In 1922, a psychic by the name of G.H. Bryant was performing at the Star Theater, I think in Bloomington. And he was asked by the Clinton Daily Public about a robbery that had occurred at the home of Dr. G.S. Edmondson. He was the man who had tended to John Struble while he was dying. And they had inquired about this robbery, and after that, he turned to the murder of Chief John Struble, and he said that Chief John Struble was murdered by a man who was later killed in a street fight in Clinton, and his killer was acquitted in Lincoln. So, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. If I don't know the answer, I will make something up.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen. Let's give a little round of applause. That was pretty interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.